The pilots circling above the Pacific believed the battle was already decided. A single American torpedo bomber drifted below them, crippled, smoking, and barely holding altitude. Yet within that fragile aircraft, one crew refused to surrender. What happened next stunned every Japanese pilot who witnessed it, rewriting their assumptions about vulnerability, courage, and the unpredictable nature of aerial combat. The Pacific in 1943 was a place shaped by shifting clouds, long horizons, and encounters that could end in seconds. Japanese aviators believed they understood the rhythm of these skies, and for months they had become accustomed to watching damaged American aircraft fall into the ocean with little resistance. They saw it as a natural conclusion to aerial engagements. Once an aircraft lost power, lost altitude, or became separated from its formation, its defeat seemed inevitable. Many of them had encountered these moments repeatedly, and in their minds the pattern never changed. Yet on one quiet afternoon, far from the main formations and hidden beneath a thickening layer of coastal haze, a single TBM Avenger torpedo bomber defied that pattern. The aircraft had been struck during an attack run, and its left wing carried a long trail of smoke that made it visible from miles away. The Avenger's torpedo bay doors hung partly open. Its stabilizer shuddered in the wind, and pieces of shattered metal fluttered off into the sea below. To every Japanese pilot observing it from a higher altitude, the aircraft appeared finished. Inside the cockpit, however, the situation was not as simple as it seemed. The crew, pilot, turret gunner, and radioman, worked in near silence, each man aware that hope was fading but not yet gone. They had practiced emergency procedures countless times, yet this moment brought none of the clarity or order that training installations on American soil had promised. Instead, the cabin filled with heat, vibrations, and the persistent smell of fuel that leaked from ruptured lines deep within the fuselage. Japanese fighters moved into position, confident that a few controlled bursts would bring the situation to an end. They believed they were closing in on a routine kill, one more item in the tally of the day's operation. What they had not expected, what none of them could have imagined, was that the damaged Avenger still possessed both the will and the means to fight. And in the minutes that followed, the crew would demonstrate a level of precision and resilience that reshaped the encounter entirely. The TBM Avenger had taken off earlier that morning from the deck of an American escort carrier tasked with tracking Japanese shipping routes that threaded along a chain of small islands. Weather had been relatively calm, yet each pilot sensed an unease that accompanied any long-distance patrol over wide stretches of open water. Clouds shifted unpredictably, and the haze rolling across the horizon suggested that visibility would become more challenging as the hours progressed. During the outbound leg of the mission, the crew of the Avenger had followed standard procedures with a calm attentiveness. They checked instrument readings, verified fuel reserves, and received occasional transmissions relaying minor adjustments in course. The ocean beneath them seemed uniform and unthreatening, but the pilot understood how deceptive such calmness could be. Beneath the still surface, entire fleets maneuvered, waited, and prepared, and the possibility of encountering Japanese aircraft remained constant. Yet nothing seemed unusual during the early stages of the patrol. As the Avenger approached the return portion of its loop, the crew detected faint traces of movement below. A wake carved a pale line through the deep blue water. With a few coordinated decisions, the aircraft descended carefully, maintaining altitude long enough to confirm identification. Through the layered haze, the outline of a small Japanese vessel became clear. Such targets represented essential components of logistical chains, and neutralizing even a single one could disrupt operations across a wide area. The attack run commenced in a deliberate manner. The pilot maintained control despite crosswinds that tugged at the fuselage, guiding the Avenger toward the optimal release point. The bomb bay doors opened slowly, their hinges protesting under the strain of accumulated wear. In those crucial seconds, the aircraft flew low enough for the crew to distinguish individual shapes on the deck of the vessel, and the vulnerability of the approach increased sharply. Anti-aircraft fire erupted in scattered bursts, sending shrapnel upward. The Avenger endured the hits, and the torpedo release proceeded as planned, splashing into the water and continuing on its determined, silent path. Moments later, the defensive fire intensified. A sharp impact struck the left side of the aircraft, followed by another. The engine trembled, the instruments flickered, and smoke began trailing behind them. The crew recognized instantly that their return flight had become far more uncertain. The Japanese vessel receded beneath them, yet fighters were already approaching from beyond the clouds, drawn by the unmistakable trail of a damaged aircraft. The pilot initiated a climb, but the Avenger resisted. He adjusted the throttle, compensating for the uneven pull generated by the compromised wing. The turret gunner rotated his position, scanning the sky with a calm practiced over many hours at sea. The radioman attempted to send updates while also securing loose components within the rattling cabin. Although the situation seemed grim, none of the three spoke. Their silence was shaped not by fear, but by the clarity that comes from confronting a challenge that leaves no room for hesitation. Japanese fighters spotted the struggling bomber, and their initial movements reflected the confidence of pilots accustomed to facing far weaker opponents. They descended gradually, adopting a formation designed to intimidate as much as attack. For them, this was a moment to execute a familiar pattern, yet they overlooked the resilience concealed within the damaged Avenger. And now the real encounter was about to begin. The first Japanese fighter approached from above and behind, positioning itself at an angle ideal for targeting an aircraft with limited maneuverability. Its pilot had observed countless engagements like this one. He anticipated a brief exchange followed by the inevitable descent of the enemy bomber. Yet as he closed the distance, he noticed subtle irregularities. The Avenger did not maintain a predictable flight path. Although damaged, it moved with small but deliberate adjustments that hinted at a pilot still fully engaged. Inside the Avenger, the pilot concentrated intensely on stabilizing the aircraft. He sensed vibrations coursing through the frame and the uneven pull of the left wing. Yet he harnessed every remaining ounce of control to shape the aircraft's path in a way that disrupted the expectations of approaching adversaries. He understood that survival depended not on speed or altitude, but on unpredictability and timing. The turret gunner, positioned in the rear, aligned his sights with the approaching threat. Sweat gathered beneath his flight helmet, yet his breathing remained steady. Japanese fighters had become known for their agility, and engaging them required discipline, not haste. He refrained from firing prematurely, trusting that the pilot would maneuver just enough to create a fleeting opportunity. As the enemy fighter moved into what should have been the perfect firing line, the Avenger shifted slightly. The adjustment was small, barely perceptible, but enough to disrupt the trajectory. The Japanese pilot opened fire, sending rounds sweeping across the air, yet the pattern missed the crucial components of the Avenger structure. The gunner seized the moment and fired a short, controlled burst. Tracers arced through the sky and connected with the fighter's fuselage. For an instant, the attacker wavered, then pulled away sharply, trailing smoke. Two additional fighters entered the engagement. They coordinated a pincer movement, attempting to compress the Avenger into a narrow corridor where escape seemed impossible. Yet the bomber's crew remained composed. The radioman, though unable to restore full communications, monitored internal systems and relayed essential observations. The pilot maintained a careful balance between preserving altitude and presenting deceptive movements that complicated enemy targeting. The Japanese pilots, increasingly frustrated, initiated a more aggressive assault. One descended rapidly to strike from below, while the other circled overhead, preparing a dive. This tactic had succeeded countless times before, but the Avenger's gunner recognized the sequence and prepared accordingly. When the fighter rose from beneath, attempting to line up with the belly of the bomber, the gunner leaned into his sights and delivered another focused burst. The rounds pierced the canopy of the fighter, and it spiraled downward, its trajectory disrupted beyond recovery. The second fighter dove sharply, yet the pilot of the Avenger anticipated the attack. With a measured pull on the control column, he raised the nose just enough to alter the intersecting lines of fire. The Japanese pilot overshot his mark, sweeping across the Avenger's path rather than directly through it. The bomber shuddered as airflow surged across the damaged wing, yet it held together. In that moment, the Japanese pilots watching from a distance began to grasp that this was no routine encounter. They had expected a simple conclusion, but the Avenger's crew had transformed the engagement into something entirely different. Their coordination, discipline, and refusal to break under pressure forced the attackers to reconsider their assumptions about damaged American aircraft. The fight was far from over, yet the balance of confidence had already begun to shift. The engagement stretched into a prolonged contest as additional Japanese aircraft arrived. These pilots, alerted by radio transmissions describing an unexpectedly resilient opponent, approached with heightened awareness. They circled above the Avenger, evaluating its movements and searching for a vulnerability that previous attacks had failed to exploit. The Avenger, however, had entered a rhythm shaped by the combined instincts of its crew. The pilot maintained a steady but flexible trajectory, allowing the aircraft to retain altitude while leaving room for evasive adjustments. The turret gunner monitored all arcs of approach, rotating with practiced precision as he identified each incoming fighter. The radioman, though unable to send clear distress signals, supported internal coordination and ensured that every change within the aircraft was communicated instantly. Japanese pilots attempted a synchronized attack, sweeping in from multiple angles. The formation created an imposing sight, and under ordinary circumstances a bomber with this level of damage would not have survived such pressure. Yet the Avenger's crew had learned to anticipate and counter these movements in real time. The first fighter dove from above, seeking to deliver a precise burst to the engine. The Avenger shifted subtly, and the rounds missed by a narrow margin. The gunner responded with disciplined timing, firing only when he could track the fighter's path without wasting ammunition. His rounds connected with the right wing of the attacker, forcing it to peel away. A second fighter approached from the side, attempting to exploit the bomber's blind spot. The pilot of the Avenger tapped into experience gained from long hours of training, adjusting his bank just enough to reveal the approaching threat to the turret. The gunner rotated quickly, firing a stream of rounds that traced the arc of the incoming aircraft. Though the fighter avoided direct hits, the aggressive response forced it to break off. As the engagement continued, the Japanese pilots grew increasingly cautious. The damaged aircraft below them had refused to collapse under pressure, and they recognized that each approach brought risk. One fighter attempted a high-speed pass, aiming to overwhelm the Avenger with sheer momentum. The bomber shook violently as the fighter streaked past, but once again the gunner delivered a measured burst. Sparks trailed from the attacker's tail section as it climbed away. The cumulative effect of these exchanges influenced the Japanese formation. They had underestimated the defensive capabilities of a single, wounded bomber and now found themselves recalibrating strategies mid-flight. Several pilots repositioned at a greater distance, observing the Avenger's movements as though attempting to decode the underlying pattern. Inside the Avenger, fatigue began to build. The pilot felt the strain in his arms as he wrestled with the controls of an aircraft, increasingly reluctant to respond. The gunner's shoulders ached from maintaining constant readiness. The radioman worked with limited equipment, but he continued to assess structural integrity and changes in vibration. Despite their exhaustion, each man understood that their moment-to-moment coordination had become the core of their survival. The Japanese fighters regrouped for another attempt, yet hesitation lingered within their formation. The encounter had reached a point where the outcome was no longer determined by the physical condition of the aircraft, but by the resolve of those within it. The Avenger's crew had demonstrated that even a crippled bomber could reshape the dynamics of aerial combat when discipline, timing, and determination aligned. The sky around them remained vast and uncertain, yet the battle had shifted in ways none of the attackers had expected. The airspace over the Pacific took on a muted stillness as both sides momentarily reassessed the situation. The Japanese fighters circled cautiously, their earlier confidence replaced by analytical focus. They sought a pattern, a weakness, anything that would allow them to end the engagement decisively. Yet the damaged Avenger maintained a persistent presence in the sky, its smoke trail marking a path not of defeat, but of defiance. Within the Avenger's cockpit, the pilot studied the movements of the fighters. He understood the limitations of his aircraft and the increasing difficulty of maneuvering with a damaged wing. Still, he recognized that maintaining altitude, even briefly, offered the best chance of survival. Every adjustment required a delicate balance between conserving power and responding quickly enough to avoid incoming attacks. The turret gunner scanned the circling formation with steady precision. He had begun to understand the rhythm of the Japanese pilot's new approach. They were no longer rushing in, but probing, waiting for a lapse in coordination or an unavoidable blind spot. Yet the gunner also sensed that the longer the engagement stretched, the more pressure shifted onto the attackers. Every missed opportunity weighed on them, and each defensive burst from the Avenger reinforced the uncertainty building among the enemy pilots. When the Japanese fighters initiated their next coordinated sequence, they attempted a multi-angle dive designed to overwhelm the Avenger's defenses. 3 fighters descended simultaneously, each committing to a line intended to narrow the bomber's options to almost nothing. In previous battles, such tactics had produced quick results, but the Avenger's crew responded with remarkable composure. The pilot nudged the aircraft into a subtle roll that altered the flight path just enough to disrupt the clean convergence of the attackers. The turret gunner focused on the fighter approaching from the steepest angle, firing a steady series of rounds that forced the attacker to correct its approach. Another fighter passed dangerously close to the Avenger, its guns flashing briefly before overshooting. The third attempted a sweeping arc along the bomber's flank, but vibrations from the Avenger's damaged frame created unanticipated turbulence that threw off the attack. Although these exchanges did not eliminate any additional fighters, they shifted momentum further. The Japanese pilots began to understand that persistence alone would not guarantee victory. They had expected a simple adversary, yet they now confronted a crew willing to adapt their tactics continuously, even while managing critical damage. A brief lull settled over the engagement as the Japanese formation regrouped once more. The Avenger maintained its position, though the aircraft's condition deteriorated steadily. The left wing trembled with increasing intensity, and the engine emitted rhythms that indicated rising strain. The radioman monitored these changes and communicated them calmly, ensuring that the pilot and gunner could anticipate potential failures before they occurred. The attackers recognized that time itself had become an adversary. Fuel levels dropped, operational priorities shifted, and maintaining a prolonged engagement grew increasingly costly. Several fighters began to widen their circle, their movements reflecting a subtle but significant shift in intention. They were reconsidering the value of continuing the attack against an opponent that had proven unexpectedly resilient. The Avenger's crew, exhausted yet resolute, sensed that the pressure on the enemy had reached a point where survival seemed possible. The battle had begun as a one-sided pursuit, yet through persistence, coordination, and an unwavering refusal to collapse under relentless assault, the damaged bomber had transformed the encounter into a contest defined not by machinery, but by resolve. As the engagement entered its final stage, the Japanese formation thinned slightly. A few fighters remained at a distance, observing but no longer committing to close-range attacks. The remaining aircraft that continued the engagement did so with caution, aware that approaching the Avenger carried risks not present in earlier assumptions. The pilot of the Avenger recognized that the aircraft could not sustain extended maneuvering. The left wing had begun to flex with a concerning rhythm, and the engine temperature increased steadily despite his attempts to regulate power output. He guided the aircraft along a steady descent, not as an act of surrender, but as a method of controlling the inevitable. By managing the descent, he preserved enough stability for the gunner to maintain defensive coverage. The turret gunner's awareness grew sharper with each passing moment. He knew that any lapse could open the window Japanese pilots waited for. His hands ached, yet he ignored the discomfort, maintaining a calm readiness shaped by the understanding that the final moments of an encounter often determined its outcome. He continued to track each fighter, waiting patiently for any indication of an approach. One Japanese aircraft finally committed to another attack run. It descended from a high angle, attempting to exploit what appeared to be a weakening posture. Yet the Avenger's crew anticipated the move. The pilot shifted the aircraft's nose upward just enough to distort the fighter's line of fire, while the gunner delivered a stream of rounds that traced the descending path. The fighter banked away sharply, abandoning what had seemed moments earlier like a favorable opportunity. Another fighter approached from the rear, attempting a measured and cautious pass. The Avenger's gunner rotated smoothly, firing only when he could maintain a consistent trajectory. His rounds connected with the fighter's tail assembly, forcing it to withdraw. Although no aircraft fell from the sky during this exchange, the psychological weight of these defensive responses grew significant. The Japanese formation loosened further. What began as an assured pursuit had evolved into a prolonged contest against an unexpectedly formidable opponent. The damaged Avenger, despite trailing smoke and losing altitude gradually, continued to project a defense that Japanese pilots found both confounding and admirable. Inside the bomber, the radioman monitored the worsening internal conditions. He reported a slow increase in vibration levels and the gradual decline of hydraulic responsiveness. His voice remained steady, shaped by an acceptance that their efforts had already exceeded expectations. He understood that the aircraft would not remain airborne indefinitely, yet the survival of the crew now seemed possible in ways unthinkable at the start of the encounter. The Japanese pilots, recognizing the diminishing value of continuing the engagement, finally began to withdraw. Their departure unfolded without ceremony. One by one, they turned toward distant bases or rendezvous points, leaving the Avenger behind. It wasn't a gesture of defeat, but of recognition. The engagement had extended far beyond the boundaries of a typical encounter, and the damaged bomber had demonstrated a resilience that defied the assumptions of even the most seasoned fighters. With the attackers gone, the Avenger settled into the final portion of its descent. The sky remained broad and silent, broken only by the steady hum of an engine nearing its limits. The pilot guided the aircraft downward, searching for a stretch of calm water that offered the best chance of survival upon ditching. The crew prepared steadily, their movements shaped by routine and the sober awareness of what lay ahead. The ocean, glistening beneath the late afternoon light, awaited them. Yet the Avenger had survived the impossible, and the crew understood that their courage had reshaped an encounter that had once seemed hopeless. When the Avenger finally touched the surface of the Pacific, it did so with a controlled glide that reflected the pilot's final reserve of skill. The fuselage struck the water with a heavy impact, sending spray in all directions. Yet the aircraft maintained coherence long enough for the crew to evacuate in an organized manner. They deployed emergency equipment, moved to a safe distance, and watched as the bomber settled into the water and disappeared beneath the waves. The silence that followed felt profound. For the first time since the attack had begun, the sky held no threats. The Japanese fighters had vanished, and the battle that had stretched across so many minutes now existed only as memory. The three men floated together, breathing in the humid air and absorbing the weight of what they had endured. Rescue arrived later, guided partly by luck and partly by the persistence of American search operations that swept across wide regions of the Pacific. When the crew was finally brought aboard a nearby vessel, their account of the encounter spread quickly among those who understood the difficulty of their situation. Word traveled from one squadron to another, and soon the story reached officers who commanded air operations across a broad sector. Japanese pilots later described the encounter as one of the rare moments when assumptions collapsed under the weight of reality. They had pursued a damaged aircraft, expecting a routine conclusion, yet they confronted a crew whose determination transformed vulnerability into resilience. The Avenger's refusal to yield demonstrated that damaged aircraft could still pose significant threats, reshaping tactical considerations for future engagements. For the American crew, survival was not defined by heroic declarations or extraordinary moments, but by the disciplined execution of their training, the trust between three men working within the confined space of a failing aircraft, and the steady belief that each decision, no matter how small, carried meaning. Their story became one of the many accounts that illustrated the unpredictable nature of combat in the Pacific, where the boundary between defeat and survival remained thin. The damaged Avenger did not return to its carrier, yet its final mission reshaped perspectives on both sides of the conflict. Japanese pilots who witnessed the encounter spoke of it with a mixture of respect and disbelief, while American aviators saw in it a reminder that resolve could alter the course of even the most unbalanced engagements. Above the ocean that had nearly claimed them, three men had refused to fall quietly, and their determination echoed long after the fading trails of smoke dispersed into the widening Pacific sky. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WWII Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.